Hi, and welcome to Chicano Theater 103D, the beginning of the Chicano theater movement, arts, activism, and the search for identity. This is an introduction to the beginning of the Chicano theater movement with an emphasis on its socio-political context. How did the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, the Beatles, the Great Society, a small strike by Filipino agricultural workers in Delano, California, and many other historical circumstances helped spark an artistic and cultural movement? How did these seemingly unrelated events lead union activist and UFW co-founder Dolores Huerta to set up a meeting between Cesar Chavez and a young theater artist named Luis Valdez? How was an individual and generational search for identity influenced and to a certain extent defined by an artistic vision and some cool 60s music? This is the start of that story. The social political context surrounding events in 1965 and how these events helped spark an artistic movement. So, what were the social and political climate and circumstances of the 1960s? U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson proclaims his Great Society during his State of the Union address. This was the largest social and economic legislation since FDR's New Deal. The Vietnam War, the domino theory of communism, the draft, and responding to the draft, student protest. The Civil Rights Movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King, the Selma Marches. The Watts Riots, or the Watts Rebellion and Uprising, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, of Malcolm X in 1965, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, and of Robert F. Kennedy, also in 1968. Now, let's iris in on 1965 and all the social unrest and change that happened in just that 1 year and how that might have led to a seminal moment in Chicano history. January, Eastern Airlines Flight 663 crashes into the Atlantic Ocean and explodes, killing everyone on board. February, the Vietnam War. The United States troops have their first combat mission. A Marine Corps Hawk Air Defense Battalion is sent to South Vietnam. March, Vietnam War. A car bomb explodes in front of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, killing 22 and wounding 183 others. April, a Rolling Stone concert in London, Ontario is shut down by police after 15 minutes due to unrest and rioting. May, 40 men burned their draft cards at UC Berkeley, and a coffin is marched to the Berkeley Draft Board. June, the Supreme Court of the United States hands down its decision in Griswold versus Connecticut, effectively legalizing the use of contraceptive by married couples. July, Bob Dylan goes electric. The Dylan controversy explodes as he plugs in at the Newport Folk Festival, signaling a major change in folk music and rock music, from soft, socially based folk music to electric rock and anti-war sentiment in music. August 11th, the Watts Riots begins. The Watts Riots of Los Angeles is engulfed in violence and flames over the alleged incident of police brutality. September 1965, the mostly Filipino-American members of the AFL-CIO affiliated Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee walk out on strike against the Delano area grape growers on September the 8th. Larry Itiliong, leader of the AWOC, asks Cesar Chavez, largely Latino, United Farm Workers Association to support and join the walkouts. On September 16th, Mexican Independence Day, the United Farm Workers Association, with 1,200 member families, votes to join the strike. Thus begins the 5-year Delano grape strike and boycott. October, The Catholic worker movement stages an anti-war rally in Manhattan, including a public draft card burning, the first of such acts to result in arrest under a new amendment to the Selective Service Act. November, Norman Morrison, a 31-year-old Quaker, sets himself on fire in front of the river entrance to the Pentagon to protest the use of napalm in the Vietnam War. In December, A Charlie Brown Christmas, first in the series of Peanuts television specials, debuts on CBS. What? Why would I mention that? In December of 1965, A Charlie Brown Christmas. Because I would hazard a guess that most of us remember A Charlie Brown's Christmas. Perhaps most of us still view it every Christmas. I know I view it almost every Christmas. After Thanksgiving, we start to hear the music, very well-known, very recognized music. We smile. We remember 1965 in the Charlie Brown Christmas. But how many of us remember the civil unrest, the social upheaval that took place in 1965 due to the efforts of the civil rights movement, the protests of the anti-Vietnam War movement, and how all of that perhaps supported, laid the groundwork for a group of disenfranchised agricultural workers to bond together, Filipino and Latino, and form a union. How a group of previously unpowerful, not listened to, farm workers, campesino, formed a union, took a big step, and went out on strike. That's what happened in 1965. So how did these events of 1960s, and in particular 1965, which we've already mentioned, leads to an empowerment of these Filipino and Chicano Latino workers to form a union? How did these events lead to the Chicano theater movement? These two, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, founders and leaders of the United Farm Workers Union. Leaders and organizers with Larry Itiliong of the grape strike and the boycott of grapes in Delano, California. So what is a Chicano? What do you think? What do you think a Chicano, Chicana, Chicanex, Chicani might be? Write it down. I'm going to give you 30 seconds, a little music, and I want you to write down what you think, only you're going to know, but what you think a Chicano might be. Okay, did you write something down? Good. Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx might refer to Americans of Mexican ancestry. Chicano, Chicana can be a chosen self-identity of some Mexican Americans in the United States, mostly but not only limited to the southwestern part of the United States. The term can also be a search for identity. It can be a reference to Aztlan, the Mexica Aztec mythical homeland, a place where Nahuatl Aztec Mexica myth says their ancestors came from the north following a prophecy, looking for an island in the middle of a lake, and on that island there would be a cactus, and on that cactus there would be an águila, an eagle, holding a serpent in its mouth. Where was that mythical homeland to the north? Aztlan? Perhaps some people hypothesize it was in the southwestern part of the U.S. But they came following those prophecies, traveling for years, and in what is now known as Mexico City, found a lake. On the lake, the mythical island they were searching for. On the island, the cactus. On the cactus, the eagle. And in the eagle's beak, a serpent. There they founded their capital of Tenochtitlan. The term Chicano can also be an awareness of activism. It can also be an acknowledgement of arts and culture, Chicano culture. There's Mexican culture, and very related, but also different, there is Chicano culture and Chicano arts. Also, you can say that Chicana, Chicanx, Chicano is a statement of identity. It's certainly that for me. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. I grew up a Mexican. I was born in the U.S., but I lived in a barrio in San Antonio, and I was a Mexican. I spoke only Spanish at home until I started to go to school, where I started to learn English. Over the course of years, I learned more English, started speaking less Spanish at home, spoke more Spanish to my mother at home, but spoke more English with my sisters at home, and only English at school, or else risked punishment. In high school, I started thinking of myself as a Mexican American. In college, I started to hear the term Chicano. I started to study the term Chicano. Then after college, I moved to California, worked with a Chicano theater company, and there I embraced my chosen self-identity as what I call myself now, a Chicano. What else might a Chicano be? For some people, particularly when I was growing up, the word Chicano or Chicana is and was a derogatory term. I think that's less so nowadays. Also, it can be a non-hyphenated identity. What do I mean by that? I'm not Mexican-American anymore. I'm an American, but I'm also a Chicano. I'm an American with roots and part of my identity being my Mexican ancestry, but I'm an American and I identify as a Chicano. It's a chosen self-identity. And more than anything, I would say it's a political statement. I choose to identify that way. People choose to identify that way. I choose to accept that identity and to bear it proudly and to speak about it, which is what we're doing here today. Rarely can you pinpoint when an artistic, much less a theatrical movement begins, and even less point to exactly the one person who began it. But I think we can with Chicano theater. In ancient Greek theater, how did it begin? We know Aristotle's Poetics. We know that perhaps Thespis was the first actor. We know some of the early playwrights because there are a few remaining copies of their plays, but who was the first Greek playwright? We really don't know. But with Chicano theater, we know this. All those events of the 1960s that we spoke of, again, civil rights, I'm going to repeat this until you remember them, the war in Vietnam, the Delano grape strike, and the meeting of the two different Filipino and Chicano Latino labor organizations to become the United Farm Workers Union and to go out on strike. Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Larry Itiliong, that grape strike led a person to want to support and join the strike. That person was Luis Valdez. And who is Luis Valdez? Luis Valdez was born in Delano, California, to a migrant farm working family from Mexico. He, as a young man, as a child, picked crops with his family. After high school, he got a scholarship and went to San Jose State College, now known as San Jose State University. He had a full ride scholarship where he studied mathematics and physics, but he always had an interest in stories. Luis writes of himself when he was a kid, he used to make up little stories and perform, he wouldn't have called them plays in those days, but he himself would perform small little stories in his backyard for the kids in the neighborhood. When he was in college at San Jose State College, he got interested in telling more stories, so he switched his major to English, started writing these stories. And then he got interested in theater. He wrote 2 plays in college, one of which won an award, which we'll mention later in our course, and was produced there at the San Jose State College Theater Department. After he graduated, Luis Valdés studied and practiced agitprop theater, guerrilla theater, Italian commedia dell'arte, while working with the famous 1960s radical theater group, the San Francisco Mime Troupe. Taking all of that knowledge, learning more about himself, hearing about the grape strike, wanting to support that, thinking about the skills that he's learned, what he studied in college, what he's learned working with the San Francisco Mime Troupe, Luis returned to Delano, where he was born, and he asked for a meeting with Cesar Chavez to help organize the workers and support the workers, forming a cohesive union. Luis Valdés says this: the idea of trying to do something about the world using theater is a bit of a pipe dream. It may seem superficial, it may seem like a luxury, it may seem silly, but at the bottom of it all is something serious. The motivation of the human heart and the transformation of the mind are only possible through the arts. Luis Valdés first met Cesar Chavez when he was about 6 years old, growing up among the migrant workers of Delano, California, where later the United Farm Workers movement took root in the non-violent strikes and grape boycotts of the 60s and 70s. How do we get from the social political unrest of the 1960s to Chicano theater? And perhaps, how did the United Farm Workers happen at this precise moment in history? This is my opinion, based on historical facts we've already discussed and looked at. What was happening in the 60s with all of this social unrest? There was a growing group of middle-class students going to colleges, not only universities, but also state colleges like Luis, also going to community college like myself, a proud product of a community college. And there was also this movement of folk music to support the social issues of the day. There was also rock music writing about civil rights, writing about and against the war in Vietnam. So there was this social unrest and agitation, but there was also peace and love and brotherhood. There was Woodstock. There was support, widespread support for the civil rights movement, widespread support for Johnson's The Great Society, an awakening of what was happening in the country, of the disproportionate sense of resources for all Americans. So these things in the 60s, this opening awareness, this sense of peace, this sense of brotherhood and supporting everyone, I think this gave an impetus, gave strength, gave a reason to believe that they could do something. In September 1965, the Filipino grape workers of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, led by Larry Italiong, walked out on strike against the Delano area table and wine grape growers, protesting years of poor pay and conditions. And then they asked for support. So Larry and the Filipino members of the AWOC, as Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and the mostly Latino Farm Workers Union, the United Farm Workers Association, to come together in brotherhood and sisterhood and join their strike. Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers Union. We have that now in 1965. Luis Valdés wanted to be involved in the Farm Workers Union, and he saw and felt that perhaps the Delano grape strike was trying to close one of the loopholes left in the 1930s labor movement. By that I mean one big group of laborers who were not yet represented by a union, who did not yet have union support. These, of course, were the farm workers, the campesinos. Luis Valdez travels to Delano, and after meeting with Dolores Huerta, the co-founder of the United Farm Workers Association, and asked for a meeting with Cesar Chavez, who he knew. But there was a big strike, lots of organizing. Cesar was very busy. Finally, a late-night meeting between Cesar and Luis Valdez led to an understanding and Cesar's support of Luis using his skills and the idea he had pitched of starting some kind of a theater organization to present the problems that were happening at the strike on the picket line as a way of eliciting support for people to join the union and not cross the picket line. Cesar accepted the idea, and El Teatro Campesino was founded in 1965 on the Delano grape strike picket lines of Cesar Chavez United Farm Workers Union. What was the first thing that they did? What was their primary goal? Their primary goal was simple and one: to support the strike, to convince people not to cross the picket line, but instead to join the union. That was the overriding principle and reason for the beginning of the Chicano theater movement and the start of El Teatro Campesino. The company, El Teatro Campesino, created and performed short skits, not in theaters, but on flatbed trucks and in union halls. So we know now that the birth of the Chicano theater movement stems directly from the United Farm Workers Union, the strike and the boycott, because Luis goes directly to Delano, speaks to Dolores, speaks to Cesar Chavez, and gets his approval to form some kind of a theatrical event to support the grape strike. The birth of the Chicano theater stems directly from the union, the strike, and the boycott, the 1960s social unrest, and a questioning of authority, of the status quo, of farm workers feeling they had the right to ask for decent living conditions and wages. It's had an important influence. It encouraged all of these farm workers to get together and encouraged Luis Valdez to come to Delano and support the union, to try and use his skills to support his childhood acquaintance. So he offered his skills. And he was the right person in the right place at the right historical and theatrical opportune time to begin, create the Chicano theater movement. It was a perfect storm of historical events, and he was the right person with the right skills, energy, ambition, and charisma to offer his help to Cesar and the farm workers' struggle. But in this case, what came first? If you remember, the subtitle of this class is Arts, Activism, and the Search for Identity. We've already talked a little bit about what is a Chicano. Arts and activism. What came first? The arts? What came first? The activism? In this case, does it have to be different? I believe not. I believe in this case that they came together importantly and at the right time. There wouldn't have been Chicano theater without the activism of supporting the union. There wouldn't have been Chicano theater without Luis Valdez's skills and ambition to seize this moment, this sense of activism, and do something artistic to support the strike. Arts and activism. El Teatro Campesino was born from the struggles of the 1960s and Luis Valdez's skills and knowledge of carpa, or Mexican popular theater. Bertolt Brecht, German playwright and poet, and his Alienation Effect and Learning Play. 3, the Italian theater movement known as Commedia dell'arte. 4, the San Francisco Mime Troupe and Agitprop Theater, and how the San Francisco Mime Troupe exposed Luis Valdez to these different aspects of their work and how he used that, gained those skills, practiced and studied perhaps with the San Francisco Mime Troupe, and then took his skills to support the United Farm Workers. We're going to move on to our next major topic, which is El Teatro Campesino and the birth of the acto. But before we do, I'd like you to see this film. There was a poem written by a Chicano activist, former boxer, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, in Denver, Colorado, in the mid-60s. It was very popular, very widespread. Every barrio newspaper published a copy of this poem. Every political speaker in the Chicano movement knew this poem, if not by heart, had sections of it he would read out at a speech or a gathering. This very influential poem is called I Am Joaquin by Corky Gonzalez. In 1967 to 69, Luis Valdez worked on this film, this somewhat docudrama version of his poem, of Corky Gonzalez's poem. He added imagery, he added music, he added his own beautiful voice. The voice you'll hear narrating this poem is Luis Valdez himself. And he produced it and sent it out so it could be seen by more people, and also as a way of raising revenue to support El Teatro Campesino. Also, the reason we're looking at this poem next, before we move on to discuss El Teatro Campesino and the birth of the acto, is that I want you to consider deeply the meaning thematically of this poem, I Am Joaquin. Who is Joaquin? Joaquin is a Chicano. Basically, the nature of this poem is the meaning and the question of what is a Chicano. I Am Joaquin by Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, directed by Luis Valdez, and produced by El Teatro Campesino. I'll see you after you view this film. Thank you.